I want to talk about the paradox of suffering. The paradox of suffering essentially states that the most valuable lesson you can learn is that suffering has no value, and the only way to learn it is through suffering. This would make you think, and this makes many people think on Earth, that suffering has a tremendous amount of value. In reality, it doesn't. The only thing that it teaches you, the only thing that it can give you, is the understanding that it doesn't have any value. Let me give some examples. People will often say that a little bit of suffering, or maybe even a lot of suffering, will make you tough, and that that's valuable. Here's the thing. Why is it valuable? Why is it valuable to be tough? Being tough is valuable because it makes you resistant to suffering. But if suffering was valuable, why would you want to be resistant to it? If suffering was actually valuable, you would want to be the most weak and pathetic thing ever so that you could suffer as much as possible, thus being able to derive the most amount of value. So suffering makes you tough, and being tough is great because it makes it so that you don't suffer, which means suffering is valuable because it's not valuable. Suffering builds character. It makes you a better person. Okay, so what does that mean? What is a person with good character, a person who is a better person, who becomes a better person? What does that mean? Does that mean that they start chaining people to walls and then torturing them? Because if suffering had value, then that is what they would be. Typically when people say that it makes you a better person or builds character, they mean that it made you have a higher degree of empathy, or put you in a position where you can help alleviate the suffering of other people. You know, oh, well, now I'm much better at providing and treating people with respect. Okay, well, that is good because then there's less suffering. So this is a law of the universe itself. All forms of suffering are always completely worthless. And if you feel like it's incredibly valuable, just look a little bit closer and you'll be able to tell, like, okay, well, why is this valuable? And you'll find that it's valuable because it's teaching you that it's not actually valuable, which is incredibly valuable to know because then you don't have to suffer anymore. It's unfortunate because for many people, it is incredibly difficult for them to leave behind their attachments to suffering. They'll have some sort of traumatic event, or they will have pushed themselves way too hard in the past, and it would have given them something great. Like maybe they're in a fantastic position now because they went through a bunch of suffering. And for them, that means that the suffering was valuable. If it was actually valuable, then they wouldn't have ever wanted it to go away. They would want to still be in the terrible situation because then they would just keep accumulating more and more value. Right. It's valuable because it got them out of that state, which means it's not actually valuable. But people don't think that way. It's difficult for humans to think outside of the paradox. And so that when you start to tell people like, oh, well, actually your suffering was completely worthless. It had absolutely no value at all. And we should be building a world in which people know that, and they don't even need to suffer in order to learn that. They'll start going off on you. They'll start getting crazy. And just almost any negative ideology or political belief is based on a lack of understanding of the paradox of suffering. They haven't solved the paradox yet. They still believe that suffering is necessary. It's important. It has to happen. It doesn't. As long as everyone understands the paradox of suffering, we don't have to have suffering in order to learn that suffering is bad. In the soul trap theory, or the wheel of samsara, the thing that keeps you trapped in the cycle of suffering is an attachment to suffering. You have to believe that you still have something to learn from suffering, that there's still some value to it. And if you believe that, then when you die, you're not going to choose to reincarnate somewhere that's good. You're going to choose to reincarnate somewhere that has suffering. A lot of people mistake it when they look at like these ancient spiritualities. They see that, oh, like look at these enlightened people and look at their opinions and their beliefs on suffering. Really, in order to escape the cycle of suffering, you have to become at one with suffering and you have to accept it. But the thing is, those people, they already accept it. They already believe it's valuable. They already like it. They already want it. Or they don't like it, but they say that they're learning from it and that it's important. That's the attachment to suffering. You have to drop that part. The part that they think is enlightenment is actually the thing that's holding them back. The most valuable lesson that someone can learn throughout all their lifetimes is that suffering has absolutely no value whatsoever. The only way to learn that lesson is by suffering. Therefore, suffering teaches you the most valuable lesson. Does that mean that it has value? The answer is no, it doesn't. Suffering does not have value. The understanding that it has no value has value. And in order to learn that, you have to suffer. But that doesn't mean that suffering itself has value. In fact, it can only be defined by being the absence of value. So essentially, you get to pick whether or not it has value. And if you choose to believe that it does have value, then that's what it will feel like for your whole life. You'll still feel like there's something that you're missing, which there is. You haven't figured it out yet. You haven't figured out that it's not valuable yet. So as long as you believe that it has value, it will always like find a way to self-justify inside of your mind. which is what makes solving the paradox of suffering so difficult. But you do need to solve the paradox of suffering in order to escape any cycle of suffering that you might be in, either in this life or any others. And the reason for that is so simple. It's just because if you find value in suffering, you're just going to make choices that seek out value, which you consider to be suffering. How do we interact with people who have yet to solve the paradox of suffering? If someone still believes that it has value and they really don't want to change their mind, what do you do with them? Because they want to suffer, and technically they need to learn the lesson, and the only way to learn the lesson is to suffer. So what do you do? Should they suffer? Well, no, they shouldn't, because it doesn't have any value. What they should do is they should stop believing that it has value. It really puts you in a difficult position anytime you want to interact with those people. But what is certain is that these people will suffer. They will make choices where they seek out value, and they define value as including suffering. And so they're always going to do stuff that perpetuates their own suffering as well as the suffering of others, dragging everyone down into their own purgatory. But the solution to the paradox of suffering is very simple. The answer is just no. It doesn't have value. Even though it teaches you the most valuable lesson, it still doesn't have any value. Join the cult.